Did Jesus rise from the grave? The answer to this question has a significant impact on your life. Because if Jesus did not rise from the grave, then he is no more than a delusional man who convinced others that he was God in the flesh who would take away the sins of the world, when in fact he was not and did not. And such a man should be ignored. But if Jesus did rise from the grave, then we have sufficient proof that he is God as he claimed to be. And if Jesus is God as he claimed to be, then we should all worship Jesus as God. Today I will present evidence that Jesus rose from the grave and thus proved that he is God. And most of the evidence I will present is based on the well-established fact that the New Testament documents are proven to be historically accurate. Now, while I discovered many ways to prove the accuracy of the New Testament while studying for what I will present here, space does not allow for a discussion of this. And while some of what we read in the New Testament may seem incredible to us, it is important to understand that the New Testament documents contain eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus in the early church, most of which were written within 30 to 60 years of the death of Jesus. This means there was too little time between Jesus' death and the writing of these documents for the writers to be describing myths or legends. Instead, the New Testament documents are accurate historical records of what actually occurred. And with these thoughts about the New Testament in mind, we will now turn our attention to 4 reasons we should believe that Jesus rose from the grave. The first reason we should believe that Jesus rose from the grave is the empty tomb. How do we know the tomb was empty? First, we have the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' disciples. All 4 gospel writers report that some of Jesus' disciples saw the empty tomb. For example, John says that he, Mary Magdalene, and Peter all saw the empty tomb. The second reason we know the tomb was empty is because Jesus' enemies made up a story that Jesus' disciples had stolen Jesus' body. Now, if his body were still in the tomb, then why make up the story? The obvious answer is that the body was not in the tomb. The tomb was empty. Now we now turn to the second reason to believe that Jesus rose from the grave. The second reason to believe that Jesus rose from the grave is the eyewitness testimony of those who say they saw Jesus after he rose from the grave. Norman Geisler and Frank Turek wrote, "We have more eyewitness documents and earlier eyewitness documents for the resurrection than for anything else from the ancient world." 2 examples of this testimony are, first, Peter told a crowd of people that God had raised Jesus to life and that he and others were witnesses of it. Second, Peter told another crowd of people that God had raised Jesus and that he and others ate and drank with Jesus after he rose from the grave. Now, from Peter's testimony, we can establish that Peter and others thought of themselves as eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection. And we can also establish that Peter and others believed God raised Jesus from the grave because they actually ate and drank with Jesus after he rose from the grave. Now, in addition to the empty tomb and eyewitness testimony, we have a third reason to believe Jesus rose from the grave. The third reason to believe that Jesus rose from the grave is because one of the biggest enemies of Christianity changed into the biggest advocate for Christianity after he saw the resurrected Jesus. Now, once called Saul, Paul was the biggest enemy of Jesus and his followers. Paul bitterly persecuted the early followers of Christ. Now, Paul's testimony about himself is that he was a blasphemer, a persecutor of Christians, and a violent man. And Paul even traveled great distances to bring followers of Christ, whom he saw as criminals, to justice. Now, on one of those journeys, Paul had an encounter with Jesus. Now, Paul did not see this encounter with Jesus as merely a vision of Jesus. Instead, Paul believed that Jesus had physically appeared to him just as he had physically appeared to the other apostles, to James, and to 500 people at one time. Paul said that Jesus told him that he would become a witness of Jesus' resurrection. Now, before this encounter, Paul tried to destroy Christianity. But after this encounter, Paul began to preach and suffer for the faith he once tried to destroy. Now, what caused Paul to change his mind about and even suffer for Christianity? The most reasonable explanation is that Paul saw the resurrected Jesus as he claimed. Now, I'll expand on this as I move to the fourth and final reason to believe that Jesus rose from the grave. The fourth reason to believe Jesus rose from the grave is the behavior of the eyewitnesses. Now, does the fact that the disciples and Paul claimed they saw Jesus after he rose from the grave actually prove that they saw Jesus? Well, only if we have good reason to believe that they were telling the truth. And we have at least two good reasons to believe that these eyewitnesses were telling the truth. First, we have the fact that they were willing to suffer and die for their belief that Jesus rose from the grave, and many of them did suffer and die. For example, Peter was crucified and Paul was beheaded for their testimony about Jesus' resurrection. Now, either they saw Jesus after his resurrection, or they suffered and died for something that they knew was a lie. Now, it is reasonable to think that people will suffer and die for things that they believe are true, but it is unreasonable to think that people would suffer and die for something that they know to be false. Secondly, those who claimed they had seen the risen Jesus left behind some of their most cherished beliefs and practices and adopted new ones seemingly overnight. Now, according to Geisler and Turek, among the 1,500-year-old plus institutions they gave up are the animal sacrifice system, the binding supremacy of the law of Moses, strict monotheism, the Sabbath, and a belief in a conquering Messiah. Now, these people were not looking for a new religion. They already believed they were following the one true God in the one true way. And therefore, it is unlikely that Jesus, who claimed to be the Messiah and then was crucified on the cross and died on the cross, could have convinced them to leave their cherished beliefs and practices behind to follow him, much less become followers who were willing to die for him. Unless something extraordinary happened to make these men and women change their beliefs and practices. And the most obvious explanation, or most logical explanation for why they would do so, is because something extraordinary did happen. They actually saw the risen Jesus as they claimed. Now I'll conclude with the question I began with. Did Jesus rise from the grave? As we have seen, it is the most reasonable explanation for the empty tomb, the disciples' testimony that they saw Jesus after he rose from the grave, for the biggest enemy of Christianity becoming Christianity's biggest advocate, and for the behavior of the eyewitnesses. The most reasonable explanation for that is that Jesus did rise from the grave as these witnesses claim. And the fact that Jesus rose from the grave as these witnesses claim, and like he said he would, is sufficient proof that Jesus is God as he claimed. And since Jesus is God as he claimed, shouldn't we all worship Jesus as God?